On the dawn of May 10th, 1775, a cold mist drifted across the narrow waters of Lake Champlain. The stone walls of Fort Ticonderoga stood silent against the grey morning, their cannons pointing toward a frontier that had already witnessed decades of imperial war. Inside the fortress, most of the British garrison slept peacefully, convinced that this isolated outpost lay far from any immediate danger. Yet across the dark water, hundreds of determined colonial volunteers guided their boats toward the shore with muffled oars. Many had never fought together before. Few wore uniforms. Some carried hunting muskets, others old military weapons. But every man understood that before sunrise, they intended to seize one of Britain's strongest fortresses without firing a battle that could have changed the course of American history before the Revolution had truly begun. Only 3 weeks earlier, musket fire had echoed across the villages of Lexington and Concord. What began as an attempt by British regulars to confiscate colonial military supplies had instead ignited open resistance throughout New England. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and craftsmen had surrounded Boston, trapping thousands of British soldiers inside the city. Yet despite this remarkable response, the colonies faced an uncomfortable reality. They possessed courage in abundance, but they lacked the heavy artillery needed to challenge the world's most powerful empire. Cannons were expensive, difficult to manufacture, and scattered across the colonies. Without them, even the largest patriot army would struggle to break fortified British positions. That problem would soon make an old French fortress hundreds of miles away suddenly more important than anyone had imagined. Fort Ticonderoga occupied one of the most strategic locations in North America. Built by the French during the 7 Years' War, it overlooked the narrow passage connecting Lake Champlain and Lake George, controlling a natural highway stretching between Canada and the Hudson Valley. In 1758, British forces had suffered a devastating defeat attempting to capture it, only succeeding the following year. Since then, the fortress had gradually slipped into neglect. Britain no longer considered it a front-line position. Its walls still appeared formidable, but its importance seemed to have faded with the previous war. That assumption would prove to be a costly mistake. Among those watching events unfold was Ethan Allen, a bold and outspoken leader of the Green Mountain Boys. Originally formed to defend settlers' land claims in what is now Vermont, the Green Mountain Boys had become skilled frontiersmen, accustomed to hardship and conflict. Allen possessed enormous confidence, sometimes bordering on recklessness, but he also understood that speed often outweighed perfection. When word spread that Fort Ticonderoga remained lightly defended, he saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Yet another man was already moving toward the same objective. Benedict Arnold arrived carrying authorization from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety to capture the fort. At this point in history, Arnold's name inspired admiration rather than suspicion. He was energetic, ambitious, and eager to strike Britain wherever an opportunity appeared. When he reached the gathering militia, however, he discovered that Ethan Allen already commanded the loyalty of most of the volunteers. Two determined leaders now stood before the same mission, each believing he had legitimate authority. For a moment, the expedition risked collapsing before it had even begun. Instead, necessity overcame pride. Allen and Arnold agreed to share command, an uneasy compromise held together by the urgency of the moment. Delays would only increase the chance that British reinforcements might arrive, or that news of the expedition could reach the garrison. The force assembled quickly, though not without difficulty. There were too few boats to transport everyone across the lake at once. As darkness settled over the water on May 9th, only part of the attacking force managed to cross before dawn approached. Waiting for the rest would sacrifice surprise. Advancing with fewer men would increase the danger. It was a gamble that could easily have ended in disaster. The shoreline was quiet except for the splash of boots against wet stones. The air carried the smell of damp earth and pine forests surrounding the old fortress. You can almost hear the whispered instructions as men checked their muskets one final time before climbing the rocky slope toward the walls. Every minute mattered. If a sentry raised the alarm, the defenders could retreat behind thick stone walls and bring dozens of cannon to bear. Instead, fortune favored the attackers. The outer defenses were poorly guarded, and the small British garrison had little reason to expect an assault before sunrise. The Americans rushed through the entrance before organized resistance could form. Confused British soldiers emerged from their quarters, some barely awake as armed colonials flooded the parade ground. Captain William Delaplace, commanding the fort, found himself surrounded almost immediately. According to later accounts, Ethan Allen demanded that the fort be surrendered in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Historians continue to debate whether those were his exact words, but there is little doubt that the demand itself was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming surprise and virtually no chance of successful resistance, Delaplace surrendered. The entire operation lasted only minutes. Almost unbelievably, one of Britain's most famous frontier fortresses had fallen with virtually no bloodshed. The Americans captured dozens of cannon, mortars, howitzers, muskets, ammunition, and desperately needed military supplies. The psychological impact spread even faster than the news itself. Across the colonies, many had feared that challenging the British Army meant certain defeat. Now they had watched volunteer militia seize a major fortress through bold planning and extraordinary timing. Confidence began growing alongside determination. Yet capturing Fort Ticonderoga solved only part of the problem. Holding it would prove far more complicated. The surrounding frontier remained vulnerable. British forces still controlled Canada, and Lake Champlain remained an invasion route leading directly toward New York. The victory had opened new possibilities, but it also created new responsibilities. Military leaders soon realized that the fort could become either a priceless defensive position or an isolated trap, depending on what happened next. Meanwhile, another remarkable discovery waited inside the captured fortress. Those heavy cannon gathering dust within the old walls represented something far greater than trophies. Hundreds of miles away, George Washington had recently taken command of the Continental Army outside Boston. His soldiers surrounded the city, but the British remained secure behind defensive positions supported by naval power. Washington desperately needed artillery capable of threatening those positions. Without heavy guns, the siege might continue indefinitely. That realization inspired one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements of the entire Revolutionary War. A young bookseller-turned-artillery officer named Henry Knox proposed transporting the captured cannon from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. The idea sounded almost impossible. The route stretched roughly 300 miles across forests, frozen rivers, mountains, and rough winter roads. Some cannon weighed more than 2 tons. Few believed such an undertaking could succeed. Winter arrived with relentless cold, ice-covered rivers, while deep snow buried the roads. Oxen strained against sledges carrying enormous iron guns through landscapes where even ordinary travel became exhausting. Wheels broke, animals slipped, rivers threatened to crack beneath the crushing weight. You can almost feel the bitter wind cutting across frozen lakes as teams struggled forward 1 mile at a time. Every successful crossing felt like a victory of its own. Failure at any point would have left the precious artillery stranded far from the battlefield where it was needed most. Against extraordinary odds, Knox completed what became known as the Noble Train of Artillery. By early 1776, the captured guns from Fort Ticonderoga stood overlooking Boston from Dorchester Heights. When British Commander General Thomas Gage had first occupied the city, he had believed the surrounding high ground could remain secure. His successor, General William Howe, now faced an impossible choice. The newly positioned American artillery threatened both the city and the Royal Navy anchored in the harbour. Attempting a direct assault risked catastrophic losses. Remaining where he was invited bombardment. In March 1776, the British evacuated Boston, marking one of the first great strategic victories of the Revolution. Looking backward, it becomes clear that Fort Ticonderoga mattered far beyond the handful of minutes required to capture it. Its fall demonstrated that initiative could outweigh numbers, that neglected assumptions could become fatal weaknesses, and that the Revolution depended not only on famous battles, but also on daring operations carried out by ordinary volunteers willing to embrace extraordinary risks. The fortress itself would later change hands more than once during the war, reminding both sides that no victory remained permanent. But its first capture in 1775 had already secured its place in history. The story also carries a quieter lesson about the unpredictable paths of individuals. Ethan Allen would become one of the enduring heroes of the Revolution. Benedict Arnold, celebrated here for his courage and determination, would later become America's most infamous traitor after changing sides in 1780. At Fort Ticonderoga, however, neither future glory nor future disgrace had yet been written. History had not revealed its final judgments. The men crossing Lake Champlain that morning were simply focused on the mission before them. In many ways, the Revolution remained fragile throughout 1775. The Continental Army was inexperienced. Congress lacked money. Supplies were scarce. Independence itself had not yet been declared. Success was far from guaranteed. Yet the capture of Fort Ticonderoga provided something every revolution desperately needs during its earliest days. Proof that victory was possible. The cannons taken from its aging walls would help drive Britain from Boston, strengthen confidence throughout the colonies, and convince countless uncertain observers that resistance could achieve more than survival. It could achieve success. As the mist lifted over Lake Champlain that May morning, few participants could have imagined how far the consequences of their actions would travel. They believed they were seizing a lonely frontier fort. Instead, they captured the weapons that would defend a revolution, still fighting for its first breaths. Sometimes, history does not change with the thunder of massive battles. Sometimes it changes in the quiet moments before sunrise, when determined people row across dark water toward a fortress that an empire believed no one would dare.